Hey, what do you think you're doing here?
We're guests. We're staying here.
Don't lie to me. You don't belong in this hotel.
Sir, I paid for this room. Please back up.
I said show me proof or you're leaving. Now!
Mom, can we go?
The body camera footage captured every word of what happened that humid Tuesday evening at the Grandview Inn just outside Atlanta. What started as a family vacation to celebrate a young girl's birthday would turn into a nightmare that exposed years of systematic discrimination and ultimately cost one police officer his career while securing justice worth over $1 million. The evening began peacefully enough. Keisha Franklin had spent months planning this special trip for her daughter Zara's 8th birthday. As a single mother working 2 jobs to make ends meet, Keisha had saved every extra dollar for 6 months to afford 3 nights at what she thought was a family-friendly hotel. She wanted to give Zara something memorable, something special that would create lasting, happy memories. Keisha worked as a nurse at the local hospital during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. She rarely took time off, but Zara's birthday was different. This was going to be their first real vacation together, just the 2 of them, staying somewhere nicer than the budget motels they usually chose on their rare overnight trips. The Grandview Inn marketed itself as a premium family destination. Their website showed smiling families by the pool, children playing in the game room, and parents relaxing in the spacious lobby. The reviews were mostly positive, and the price, while expensive for Keisha, seemed reasonable for what was promised. Keisha had called ahead twice to confirm their reservation and ask about the amenities. She wanted to make sure the pool would be open and that the complimentary breakfast would be available during their stay. Everything seemed perfect. They arrived at the hotel around 4 in the afternoon. Zara was practically bouncing with excitement, clutching the small suitcase she had packed herself with her favorite clothes and the new swimming suit Keisha had bought specifically for this trip. The lobby was impressive with its marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and elegant furniture. Zara whispered to her mother that it looked like a palace. The check-in process went smoothly. The desk clerk, a young woman named Sarah, was friendly and efficient. She explained the hotel amenities, handed over the key cards, and even gave Zara a small welcome gift from the hotel. Everything felt exactly as Keisha had hoped it would. Their room was on the 3rd floor, overlooking the pool area. It was spacious and clean with 2 comfortable beds, a large television, and a beautiful view. Zara immediately ran to the window to look at the swimming pool below, already planning their evening swim. Keisha felt a surge of pride and satisfaction. She had done this. She had given her daughter something wonderful. They spent the first hour getting settled, changing into casual clothes, and exploring their room. Zara called her grandmother to describe everything she was seeing. Keisha took pictures to document their special trip. Everything was going perfectly. Around 6 in the evening, they decided to head down to the pool area. Zara had been asking about swimming since they arrived, and Keisha was looking forward to relaxing poolside while watching her daughter play. They gathered their towels, applied sunscreen, and headed downstairs, full of excitement and anticipation. The pool area was beautiful, surrounded by comfortable lounge chairs and tropical plants. A few other families were enjoying the evening, with children playing in the shallow end while parents supervised from nearby chairs. It seemed like the perfect setting for a memorable birthday celebration. Keisha chose 2 lounge chairs near the pool and began setting up their spot. Zara immediately wanted to test the water temperature, dipping her toe in and squealing with delight that it was perfectly warm. Other children in the pool waved at her, and she waved back shyly. Everything felt welcoming and normal. That's when Officer Derek Reynolds arrived. Reynolds was off duty, staying at the hotel for a weekend getaway with his wife. He had been a police officer for 12 years, working in a suburban department about an hour away from the hotel. What happened next would suggest this wasn't his first time allowing his personal biases to influence his behavior, but it would definitely be his last time doing so without serious consequences. Reynolds noticed Keisha and Zara immediately. Instead of simply enjoying his own evening, he began watching them with obvious scrutiny. He made comments to his wife about their presence that other guests would later describe as inappropriate and concerning. His wife, clearly uncomfortable, suggested they move to chairs on the opposite side of the pool, but Reynolds didn't want to move. He wanted them to move. He approached the hotel staff member who was cleaning the pool area, a teenage boy named Kevin who worked part-time during the summer. Reynolds told Kevin that there were people using the pool who didn't belong there, that they looked suspicious, and that someone should check if they were actually hotel guests. Kevin, who was 17 and had never encountered a situation like this, didn't know what to do. He explained that he was just responsible for maintaining the pool area and didn't have authority to check guest credentials. Reynolds became more insistent, flashing his police badge and saying that as a law enforcement officer, he could tell when people were somewhere they shouldn't be. The teenager became nervous and uncomfortable. He had seen Keisha and Zara arrive and set up their chairs just like any other hotel guests. They weren't causing any disturbance, weren't being loud or inappropriate, weren't doing anything that seemed problematic. But Reynolds was a police officer, and Kevin felt pressured to do something. Kevin reluctantly approached Keisha and asked if she was staying at the hotel. Keisha, surprised by the question, politely confirmed that yes, they had checked in earlier that afternoon. She offered to show her room key if needed. Kevin, embarrassed, said that wouldn't be necessary and walked away. But Reynolds wasn't satisfied. He watched Kevin's interaction with Keisha and decided the teenager hadn't been thorough enough. He approached Keisha directly. Have you ever been in a situation where you immediately knew something was wrong but hoped you were mistaken? Let me know in the comments if you've experienced that sinking feeling. Reynolds walked up to Keisha with the aggressive posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He didn't introduce himself politely or explain his concern in a reasonable way. Instead, he immediately demanded to know what she was doing there and whether she belonged at the hotel. Keisha, confused but trying to remain calm for her daughter's sake, explained that they were hotel guests enjoying the pool. She pointed to their chairs with their belongings and mentioned they had just checked in a few hours earlier. Reynolds demanded proof. He wanted to see her room key, her reservation confirmation, and identification. At this point, other guests began to notice the confrontation. A middle-aged couple sitting nearby started paying attention to what was happening. A family with 3 children stopped their conversation to watch. The atmosphere around the pool began to change from relaxed and pleasant to tense and uncomfortable. Zara, who had been playing happily in the shallow end, noticed that a man was talking to her mother in a way that seemed unfriendly. She moved closer to the pool edge, her earlier excitement replaced by concern and confusion. This was supposed to be her special birthday trip, but something was going wrong and she didn't understand why. Keisha pulled out her phone to show Reynolds their reservation confirmation and their room key. She remained polite and cooperative, though she was beginning to feel frustrated and humiliated by the unnecessary scrutiny. Reynolds examined everything with exaggerated thoroughness, taking much longer than necessary and making comments about how anyone could fake these things. Then Reynolds crossed the line that would ultimately destroy his career. He told Keisha that regardless of what paperwork she might have, she and her daughter didn't belong at this hotel. He said they were making other guests uncomfortable and that they needed to leave the property immediately. The words hung in the air like a physical slap. Every person within earshot heard exactly what Reynolds had said and understood exactly what he meant. This wasn't about hotel policies or legitimate security concerns. This was about race. Plain and simple. Keisha felt her face flush with anger and humiliation. Her daughter was watching. Other families were staring. This moment, which was supposed to be about celebrating Zara's birthday, had turned into something ugly and painful that her daughter would remember forever. But Keisha was not someone who backed down from injustice. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to allow anyone to treat her or her daughter this way. She pulled out her phone and began recording, clearly stating that she was a paying guest at the hotel and that this officer was harassing her without cause. Reynolds immediately became more aggressive when he saw the camera. He demanded she stop recording and threatened to have her arrested for disturbing the peace. He said she was creating a scene and that her behavior was exactly what he expected from someone like her. Those words, captured clearly on Keisha's video, would later play a crucial role in the legal proceedings that followed. Reynolds had just provided evidence of his discriminatory intent that no lawyer would be able to explain away. But the situation was about to get much worse before it got better. Reynolds was about to make a series of decisions that would not only end his law enforcement career, but also result in a settlement that would change Keisha and Zara's lives forever. What happened next would shock everyone who witnessed it and prove that sometimes the system does work when brave people refuse to accept injustice. Injustice. The other families around the pool had stopped their conversations entirely now. Children who had been playing moments before stood still in the water, sensing the tension even if they didn't fully understand what was happening. Parents moved closer to their own kids, unsure whether they should intervene or stay out of what was clearly escalating into something serious. Reynolds called over to his wife, telling her to contact hotel management. He said there were trespassing issues that needed to be addressed immediately. His wife, looking embarrassed and uncomfortable, reluctantly pulled out her phone. She had been married to Reynolds for 8 years and had seen his attitudes before, but never in such a public and confrontational setting. While his wife made the call, Reynolds continued his harassment of Keisha. He demanded she gather her belongings and leave the pool area immediately. When Keisha refused, explaining again that she was a paying guest with every right to be there, Reynolds stepped closer and told her that as a police officer, he had the authority to remove her from the property if necessary. This was Reynolds' next major mistake. He was off duty, in another jurisdiction, and had no legal authority to do anything beyond what any other private citizen could do. But his badge had given him power for so long that he had forgotten the limits of that power. Or perhaps he had simply never cared about those limits when it came to people he felt were beneath him. Keisha continued recording while speaking in a calm, clear voice. She stated her name, the date, and explained that she was being harassed by an off-duty police officer while trying to enjoy a vacation with her daughter at a hotel where they were registered guests. She described Reynolds' behavior and repeated his statements about them not belonging there. Other guests began pulling out their own phones. The couple, who had been sitting nearby, started recording as well. A father who was at the pool with his teenage son positioned himself where he could capture the entire interaction. Within minutes, multiple people were documenting what was happening. Reynolds noticed the additional cameras and became increasingly agitated. He pointed at the other guests and told them to mind their own business. He said they didn't understand the situation and that they were interfering with police business. Several people responded that he had already stated he was off duty and that this appeared to be harassment rather than any legitimate police business. The situation might have continued escalating indefinitely, but that's when hotel management arrived. The assistant manager, a professional woman named Lisa Chen, approached the group with obvious concern. She had been called by Reynolds' wife but had also received reports from other staff members about a disturbance at the pool. Lisa immediately assessed the situation with the trained eye of someone who had dealt with guest conflicts before. She saw a calm mother and child being confronted aggressively by a man who was clearly angry and out of control. She saw multiple other guests looking uncomfortable and recording the interaction. She understood immediately that this was not a legitimate security issue. Lisa approached Keisha first, introducing herself and asking if there was a problem. Keisha explained the situation clearly and concisely, showing her room key and reservation confirmation. Lisa verified the information on her tablet and confirmed that Keisha and Zara were indeed registered guests in good standing with no complaints or issues noted on their account. Then Lisa turned to Reynolds. She asked him to explain his concern and his role in the situation. Reynolds began a rambling explanation about suspicious behavior and his experience as a law enforcement officer, giving him the ability to identify potential problems. Lisa listened politely but with growing skepticism. What Reynolds didn't know was that Lisa had been trained extensively in recognizing and handling discrimination complaints. The hotel chain had implemented comprehensive policies after facing several lawsuits in other locations. Lisa knew exactly what she was witnessing, and she knew exactly what the hotel's response needed to be. Lisa politely but firmly told Reynolds that Keisha and her daughter were welcome guests and that there was no basis for asking them to leave. She explained that if Reynolds had concerns about hotel security, he should address them with management rather than confronting guests directly. She suggested that perhaps he and his wife might be more comfortable moving to a different area of the pool if they felt there was some kind of conflict. Reynolds exploded. He raised his voice, demanding to speak to the general manager. He said the hotel was making a serious mistake and that they would regret not backing him up. He threatened to contact the police department and have real officers come to handle the situation properly. Lisa remained calm throughout Reynolds' outburst. She explained that the general manager was not on site, but that she had full authority to handle guest relations issues. She offered to provide Reynolds with contact information for corporate management if he wanted to file a formal complaint, but she made it clear that Keisha and Zara would not be asked to leave. This was the moment when Reynolds made his final and most destructive mistake. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, reporting that there were trespassing issues at the hotel and that local police assistance was needed. He identified himself as an off-duty officer and said the situation was escalating beyond what hotel management could handle. The 911 call would later become a key piece of evidence in the legal case that followed. Reynolds had made false statements to emergency services, claiming there was a disturbance and trespassing when he knew perfectly well that Keisha was a legitimate hotel guest. He had misused his position as a police officer to try to intimidate both the hotel management and the family he was targeting. While they waited for the police to arrive, Lisa made several important decisions that would ultimately protect both Keisha and the hotel. She asked Reynolds and his wife to wait in the lobby rather than remaining at the pool area. She offered Keisha and Zara the option of moving to a different area of the hotel if they preferred, but made it clear this was not required. She also discreetly contacted her general manager and the hotel's legal department to report the incident. Most importantly, Lisa asked the guests who had been recording to provide their contact information in case the hotel needed witness statements. She understood that documentation would be crucial if this incident led to legal action. The hotel had no intention of allowing one of their guests to be discriminated against, and they wanted to be prepared to defend both their policies and their guests' rights. The local police arrived within 15 minutes. Two officers, Sergeant James Wilson and Officer Maria Santos, responded to the call. They had been told to expect a trespassing situation, but what they found was something entirely different. Lisa met the officers in the lobby and quickly explained the real situation. She provided them with copies of Keisha's reservation and registration information. She explained that a guest had been harassing another guest and making false claims about trespassing. She also mentioned that multiple witnesses had recorded the interactions. Sergeant Wilson, a 20-year veteran with extensive experience in handling domestic disputes and harassment cases, immediately understood what had actually happened. He had seen situations like this before, where off-duty officers from other jurisdictions had overstepped their authority and created problems rather than solving them. The officers spoke with Keisha first, reviewing her documentation and listening to her account of what had happened. They watched portions of the video she had recorded on her phone. They took down the contact information for the witnesses who had also recorded parts of the incident. Then they spoke with Reynolds. His story was inconsistent and defensive. He couldn't provide any specific examples of suspicious behavior beyond his general feeling that Keisha and her daughter didn't belong at the hotel. When pressed for details about what had made him think they were trespassing, he fell back on vague claims about his law enforcement experience and instincts. Sergeant Wilson asked Reynolds to step outside for a private conversation. What happened during that conversation wasn't recorded, but witnesses said Reynolds emerged looking pale and shaken. Officer Santos remained with Keisha and Lisa, apologizing for the situation and explaining that no charges would be filed because there was clearly no basis for any criminal complaint. The officers also spoke with Reynolds' wife, who was obviously mortified by her husband's behavior. She apologized repeatedly to hotel staff and expressed her embarrassment about the situation. She mentioned that this wasn't the first time her husband had acted inappropriately in similar circumstances, a comment that would later prove significant in legal proceedings. Before leaving, Sergeant Wilson provided Keisha with a report number and his contact information. He explained that she had the right to file complaints with both his department and Reynolds' home department if she chose to do so. He also mentioned that the false 911 call could potentially result in charges against Reynolds if she decided to pursue the matter further. But the immediate crisis was over. Reynolds and his wife checked out of the hotel that evening, cutting their stay short. Lisa comped Keisha's entire reservation and provided vouchers for future stays. The hotel also arranged for room service dinner to be delivered to their room, understanding that the pool area might not feel comfortable for them that evening. Zara, who had been quiet and confused throughout most of the incident, finally asked her mother what had happened and why that man had been so angry with them. Keisha faced the difficult task of explaining discrimination to an 8-year-old in terms that wouldn't crush her daughter's spirit, but would help her understand that some people in the world might treat them unfairly because of their race. That night, alone in their hotel room while Zara slept, Keisha made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to accept that her daughter's birthday celebration had been ruined by someone's prejudice. She was going to fight back, and she was going to win. What Keisha didn't know yet was that Reynolds had a history of similar incidents that his department had covered up. She didn't know that the hotel chain had been looking for an opportunity to take a strong public stand against discrimination. She didn't know that the witnesses who had recorded the incident were prepared to testify about what they had seen. Most importantly, she didn't know that her decision to fight would expose a pattern of behavior that had been hidden for years and would ultimately result in changes that would protect countless other families from experiencing what she and Zara had endured. The legal battle that was about to begin would take 18 months to resolve, but when it ended, justice would be served in a way that sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country. The next morning, Keisha woke up with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in years. While Zara was still sleeping peacefully in the bed next to her, Keisha sat by the window and began researching civil rights attorneys on her phone. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was focused. She understood that what had happened wasn't just about one bad night at a hotel. It was about a pattern of behavior that needed to be stopped. The first attorney Keisha contacted was David Richardson, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in police misconduct cases. His office was located about 2 hours from where she lived, but his reputation for taking on difficult cases and winning them was exactly what she was looking for. When she called his office and explained what had happened, Richardson's assistant scheduled an emergency consultation for the following Monday. Richardson had been practicing civil rights law for over 15 years. He had seen cases like this before, but something about Keisha's story struck him as particularly egregious. An off-duty officer harassing a mother and child at a hotel, making false statements to emergency services, and attempting to have them removed from property where they were legitimate guests, crossed multiple legal lines that could result in significant damages. During their first meeting, Richardson was impressed by Keisha's composure and the thoroughness of her documentation. She had saved every receipt from the trip, printed copies of their hotel reservation, and transferred all the video recordings to a secure cloud storage account. She had also written a detailed timeline of events while everything was still fresh in her memory. Most importantly, Keisha had contact information for 7 witnesses who had observed the incident. Richardson's experience told him that witness testimony would be crucial in establishing the scope of Reynolds' misconduct and the impact it had on his clients. He agreed to take the case on a contingency basis, meaning Keisha wouldn't pay any attorney fees unless they won. Richardson's first step was to conduct a thorough investigation into Reynolds' background and employment history. What he discovered was disturbing, but not surprising. Through public records requests and conversations with current and former colleagues, Richardson uncovered a pattern of complaints and incidents that painted a picture of an officer who had been allowed to operate without adequate supervision for years. Reynolds had been the subject of 14 internal complaints during his 12-year career. Most had been dismissed or resulted in minimal discipline like written warnings or brief suspensions. The complaints ranged from excessive force allegations to reports of discriminatory behavior toward minorities during traffic stops and other encounters. One particularly damaging incident had occurred 3 years earlier when Reynolds had stopped a black family driving through his jurisdiction late at night. The family was returning from a wedding and had done nothing wrong, but Reynolds had detained them for over an hour, claiming their vehicle matched the description of one involved in a robbery. No such robbery had been reported, and the family's complaint had been dismissed after Reynolds claimed he had received bad information from dispatch. Another incident involved a Hispanic construction worker who had been arrested by Reynolds for disorderly conduct after questioning why he was being stopped while walking to work. The charges were later dropped, but the man had spent a night in jail and lost his job due to the arrest. His complaint against Reynolds had resulted in a brief suspension, but no meaningful changes to Reynolds' behavior. Richardson also discovered that Reynolds' own department had received multiple tips about his conduct from other officers who were uncomfortable with his approach to policing. These reports had been filed with Internal Affairs, but had never resulted in serious investigation or discipline. The department had apparently chosen to protect Reynolds rather than address the obvious problems with his conduct. This pattern of protection and cover-up would become central to Richardson's legal strategy. He wasn't just going to sue Reynolds personally, he was going to go after the entire system that had enabled Reynolds to continue his discriminatory behavior for over a decade. The lawsuit Richardson filed was comprehensive and devastating. It named Reynolds as the primary defendant for violating Keisha and Zara's civil rights under federal law. It included claims for harassment, discrimination, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and false imprisonment. The damages sought were substantial, reflecting both the immediate harm caused and the broader message the case needed to send. But Richardson didn't stop with Reynolds. He also sued Reynolds' employing police department for maintaining policies and practices that allowed discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked. This was the most complex part of the case, requiring Richardson to prove that the department's failure to properly investigate and discipline Reynolds amounted to deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. The hotel chain was not included as a defendant. In fact, Richardson praised their response to the incident in his filing. The hotel's immediate support for Keisha, their cooperation with the investigation, and their clear policies against discrimination demonstrated how organizations should respond when faced with such situations. Reynolds' initial response to the lawsuit was predictable. His attorney filed a motion to dismiss, claiming that Reynolds had been acting within his authority as a police officer and that his actions were justified by legitimate security concerns. The motion argued that Reynolds had reasonable suspicion to question Keisha and that any inconvenience she experienced was minimal and didn't rise to the level of a constitutional violation. Richardson's response brief systematically demolished these arguments. He pointed out that Reynolds was off-duty, outside his jurisdiction, and had no legal authority to detain or question anyone. He noted that Reynolds had admitted on camera that his actions were based on his belief that Keisha and Zara didn't belong at the hotel, which clearly indicated discriminatory intent rather than legitimate security concerns. The federal judge assigned to the case, Judge Eleanor Hartwell, was a former civil rights attorney herself who had been appointed to the bench 5 years earlier. She had a reputation for being thorough, fair, and intolerant of discrimination in any form. Judge Hartwell denied Reynolds' motion to dismiss, finding that the allegations, if proven true, would constitute clear violations of federal civil rights law. The discovery phase of the case revealed even more damaging information about Reynolds and his department. Richardson subpoenaed Reynolds' personnel file, training records, and all complaints filed against him. The documents painted a picture of an officer who had repeatedly crossed lines but had been protected by a department culture that prioritized loyalty over accountability. Depositions were particularly devastating for Reynolds. Under oath, he was forced to explain his actions at the hotel step by step. His testimony was inconsistent, defensive, and revealed the extent of his prejudicial attitudes. When Richardson asked him to explain specifically what behavior by Keisha had seemed suspicious, Reynolds couldn't provide coherent answers. Richardson also deposed Reynolds' supervisors and colleagues. Several officers testified that they had reported concerns about Reynolds' conduct but had been told to mind their own business or had faced retaliation for speaking up. A former sergeant testified that he had recommended Reynolds be removed from patrol duties years earlier but had been overruled by higher-ranking officials who didn't want the paperwork and hassle of disciplinary proceedings. The department's internal affairs investigator was forced to admit under oath that the complaints against Reynolds had not been thoroughly investigated. In several cases, complainants had not been interviewed, witnesses had not been contacted, and evidence had not been preserved. The investigator acknowledged that the department had failed to meet basic standards for investigating misconduct allegations. Meanwhile, the impact on Keisha and Zara's lives was profound and ongoing. Zara had developed anxiety about traveling and staying in hotels. She had nightmares about angry men yelling at her mother and had required counseling to help her process what she had experienced. What should have been a happy birthday memory had instead become a source of trauma that affected her sleep, her behavior at school, and her overall sense of security. Keisha struggled with her own emotional aftermath. She found herself constantly vigilant in public spaces, worried about how she and her daughter might be perceived or treated. The incident had reinforced fears she had carried her whole life about being judged or targeted because of her race, and those fears now extended to concerns about her daughter's safety and well-being. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of the legal case documented the significant emotional distress both Keisha and Zara had experienced. The expert witness, Dr. Sarah Martinez, testified that the incident had caused symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress and that the effects were likely to be long-lasting without proper treatment and support. Public interest in the case grew as news outlets picked up the story. The video footage from the hotel incident went viral on social media, generating millions of views and widespread outrage about Reynolds' conduct. Civil rights organizations rallied around Keisha's case, seeing it as an important test of whether off-duty police officers could be held accountable for discriminatory behavior. Reynolds Police Department came under intense scrutiny as details of their inadequate complaint investigation procedures became public. The mayor and city council faced pressure to reform police oversight and accountability measures. Several other families came forward with their own stories of mistreatment by Reynolds, adding to the growing evidence of a pattern of discriminatory conduct. The department's insurance company began pushing for settlement negotiations as the evidence mounted and public pressure increased. They understood that going to trial would likely result in a much larger verdict and would generate additional negative publicity for all parties involved. Settlement discussions began in earnest about 10 months after the lawsuit was filed. Richardson's opening demand was ambitious, reflecting the severity of Reynolds' conduct and the need to send a strong message about accountability. The negotiations were complex, involving not just monetary damages, but also agreements about policy changes and accountability measures. Reynolds' personal insurance coverage was limited, but his department's liability insurance provided much more substantial protection. The insurance companies understood that the evidence against Reynolds was overwhelming and that a jury would likely award significant damages. They also recognized that the case had broader implications for police accountability that made settlement preferable to a public trial. The final settlement amount was $1.1 million, paid jointly by Reynolds and his department's insurance carriers. But the money was only part of the resolution. The agreement also required Reynolds' department to implement comprehensive reforms to their complaint investigation procedures, bias training programs, and oversight mechanisms. Reynolds himself was required to resign from his position immediately and surrender his police certification permanently. He was also prohibited from seeking employment in any law enforcement capacity in the future. The settlement agreement included a provision that he complete extensive counseling and bias training at his own expense. The department was required to establish an independent civilian oversight board with authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. All officers were required to complete enhanced training on constitutional rights, bias recognition, and appropriate use of police authority. The department also had to implement new policies requiring immediate reporting and investigation of any complaints alleging discriminatory conduct. Keisha and Zara's story proves that courage in the face of injustice can create change that protects countless others. Reynolds lost everything he had worked for, while his department was forced to implement reforms that will prevent future victims from experiencing what this family endured. Sometimes the system does work when brave people refuse to stay silent. If you think this situation was bad, wait until you see what happens in the case on the right-hand side,